Welcome back to our meetup project. In the previous videos, we already added quite some functionalities. In the last videos, we made sure that we can sign up, sign in, and get authentication errors. Now, I want to sign in and I want to work on the next big thing. When we organize a meetup, right now, we only store that locally in our Vuex store, and therefore we can see it there, but we don't persist it. We don't store it in a database on a server. This is what I want to do in this video. Let's store new meetups on Firebase. So the goal is to store new meetups on Firebase so that if we fill out this form, enter an image and everything, pick a date, that we actually write this to our real-time database on this Firebase project we're using here. Now for this, I will use the Firebase SDK, though I will highlight that if you visit the docs, and click on guides there, if you pick real-time database, this is what we'll use, the web SDK, the JavaScript SDK. You could also go with the REST API though. So you can send normal AJAX requests to this REST API to save new items in the database or get the items, and there would be nothing wrong with that. I'll stick to the SDK because, well, I also want to teach that, and because I use the SDK for signing users in and up already, but I just wanted to highlight you have that option. You don't need to use the Firebase SDK. Now with that out of the way, let me close the documentation and go back to our project code here. Now in here, this is the store opened. Right now, what we do is we have hard-coded meetups here, which we load at the beginning. And then we also have our create meetup method here, which will basically just create a new meetup constant and write that to our, well, local array of meetups. I want to keep that action, but in that action, I now, of course, want to reach out to Firebase and store it there. Now, we're already importing the Firebase SDK because we're using it for authentication. So what we can do in this create meetup action is we can use the SDK here to write data to the database. I will still create a meetup, obviously, but before I commit anything, I want to reach out to my Firebase servers. And this is important. I do this in the action because actions are the place where you do asynchronous tasks in a Vuex store. You never run any asynchronous code in mutations, so you never do that here. And of course we do have asynchronous code here because reaching out to a server, which we do in the end, and storing data there, that is just an asynchronous task. So to reach out to Firebase, I'll use the Firebase SDK. And for our authentication, we use the auth method here. Now auth gives us access to all the authentication related methods and functions. Here I want to get access to the database related ones, so we call database. Now on database, we now got this ref function. And ref is a super important function or method actually. Ref allows us to pass an argument which is basically the node in our database under which we want to store data. If you check out the real-time database here, you see that it basically is a tree of nodes. Well, we only got the root node right now, but you will soon see it becoming a tree. We don't have tables here or anything like that. We just have one big JSON object, so to say, and that is where we store our data. So to store data, I first of all need to specify a node under which I want to specify that store that data, and that node doesn't have to exist yet. Here I will name it meetups. And again, this is totally up to you what you name it. It doesn't have to exist yet. It will get created once you start writing data to it. So now I specified that I want to store data or that I want to access the meetups node. That's all I'm specifying right now. I'm not doing anything. I will call the push method next, which is one of the supported methods Firebase offers us for writing data. Push simply allows us to add data to a list. We would also have set, which is useful if you don't have a list of data, but a single object you want to set. And we also have update, and we will see update later in action, which basically allows us to update one single item. Again, here I will use push though, because of course I manage a list of meetups. Now to push, I can pass my meetup, just like that. I can remove this ID node or this ID property though, because Firebase will automatically create a unique ID for me, so I can remove that. And by the way, if you want to learn more about Firebase, check out this mini series I did together with an actual Firebase employee who gave us some deeper insight into what Firebase is and how it works. Super useful for understanding the bigger picture and some advanced pieces. Back to this project though. We're pushing this meetup constant to Firebase under this node, and that should already add it. However, this actually just gives us a promise here, so we can use then now to react to a success case. So if we successfully wrote data. Here, for now, what I will do is I will simply fetch that data we might get back here and simply log it to the console to see if that was successful. We could also fail, so let's also add a catch block to, without semicolons here, that's the style we write the code, to also see any potential errors we got. So here we might receive an error, which I then also want to output console log error, just like that. With that, we're handling all that, and we're not quite done. I will also change the place where we commit this in the future. Actually, I can do it right now. I want to commit it inside the success callback because I only want to commit this item to my local store if we successfully wrote it to the database. So with that, let's save this code and let's view it in our application. Here, let's open up the console and let's create a new meetup, maybe the Paris meetup. And I can now actually just take the data here, like the image here in my dummy meetup I have hard coded. That is in Paris, obviously. Here's the image URL. It's a nice meetup in Paris. And let's pick 24th August and maybe 5 p.m. Let's click create meetup, and you see we get something back, a strange looking object. I will come back to how we can handle this soon. Let's have a look at our database now, and you see, without updating the page, by the way, it updates automatically, that we have a new meetups node. And that's of course the node we specified here in our create meetup action, this node here. So we got this new node, and if we expand it, we see there's a new object with some cryptic key. That is this ID Firebase created automatically. It's guaranteed to be unique. And in there we got the description, the image URL, the location, and the title. You will see that the date is missing though, even though we had it in this object. The reason for that is that the date as we get it here can't be stored by Firebase. It's a date object and it can't store that. We can actually call toISO string on that date object to convert it into a string which can be stored. So why don't we try out that? So let me save this and let's quickly sign in again. By the way, of course, you don't see our newly created meetup here in the list of meetups because we don't fetch meetups from Firebase yet. So let's create a new meetup quickly, and I will do this really quick, just hammering some characters in there because I just want to see if the date gets saved now. So let's just pick any arbitrary date here. Let's click create meetup and let's have a look. New item was added, and now you see the date was stored as a string. So that's useful. Now we're already storing our meetup here. Now I will soon also add file upload so that we don't just paste a link in here, but that we can actually upload files and store them on Firebase. Before we do that though, let's think about how we can read or how we can get the meetups from Firebase and what we would need to work with them correctly. One thing we would, for example, need is the ID Firebase creates for us, this cryptic string. Previously, we hard-coded an ID into our code, but we removed that a few seconds ago. That means that if we view our meetups and we try to access our new meetup, you already see it in the bottom left corner. It's undefined, it has no ID. We tried to fetch it by ID, and it worked in the past when we hard-coded the ID, but now it's of course not working anymore because, well, we got no ID anymore. We removed the field here in our meetup. That's the meetup we commit to our store though. We tried to access a meetup by ID, we got none, error. Well, we have an ID in Firebase, and we actually get back some data object here. So maybe we have a way of getting that ID Firebase created for us and stored it in our local store too, so that we can use that Firebase ID to access the meetup. And indeed, we can. Even though the object we get back when we successfully saved our object, even though that looks rather cryptic, we can extract some useful data from it. For example, the key. So here, what I can do is I can create a new constant key and just access data key. We might not see that property when we print it to the console, but it is there. It's just a special type of object Firebase gives us back. It's a promisable, and it basically will resolve to some actual data pretty fast, so we can safely access key here. So with that, we get the key Firebase created for us, and now we can use that to adjust the meetup we want to save. So we can basically just commit an object here, where we use the spread operator here to get our meetup data, so from that meetup object. So basically just get all the properties we had in there and add them to this newly created object here. And also add our key. However, just don't just add it like that. Use ID and use key as a value. So now we're using that key Firebase created and stored as an ID to the meetup, which we actually commit to the store. With that in place, if we now save this and reload, clear the console to see we got no errors, quickly load in again, log in again, organize a new meetup. Let's just add a meetup here again. Again, pick any date we want. Let's hit create meetup. Now again, we see this was created here. Side note, if you have really good eyes, you might see that the date we store here is stored as 7 a.m. or 7:51 a.m. whilst here we did indeed save 9:51 a.m. That's just my local time zone here, and it does store the time zone here too with this character, so we are able to retrieve the correct time later. Just a side note. More interestingly, we can see that if I now click on view meetup, you see already we're using this ID and it works. We can load it. So we get the front end fixed again. However, of course, if we have a look at all the meetups, we just see the one we just created, even though we have more of them in our Firebase list. Well, we're not fetching data from Firebase yet. So let's do that too. Now, for that, we need to make sure that we fetch data whenever our application loads, basically, and we need to add a new action. Well, let's start with the action then. For that, I'll add, well, a new action. I'll call it load meetups. Here, as always, I get access to the commit method. I don't have a payload I'm interested in because I just want to load all the meetups. And there, I now want to reach out to my Firebase database again. And now I want to reach out to the ref again, so to this meetups reference where we stored all the meetups to tell Firebase which node I want to access. However, now I'm not pushing or setting anything. Instead, I want to fetch values, and there are basically two ways of getting values. The first one is the on method. On actually allows us to listen to an event. The value event is the most important one. And this is an event Firebase gives us, which is fired whenever the data changes. Keep in mind that it's called a real-time database. Firebase automatically accesses it via WebSockets, and hence we can listen to any value changes and get push notifications by the server whenever the meetups in our array of meetups change. Sounds pretty awesome, and it is. And again, check out this other video series I mentioned I did together with Abe from Google to learn more about that. Now here, I don't really need that real-time functionality though. I can use once therefore, which will just give me a snapshot and not establish a real-time connection because I'm not interested in future updates. I update my store anyways. If someone else were to add a meetup, I don't really need that live update in the list. And if I go back to the app or reload the app, I fetch all meetups anyways. Still, I pass a value here to get the value of this reference here. So get a list of all meetups. And then again, that's a promise, so I can catch errors and have my then block. I'll come back to the then block soon. Let's catch errors first. So here I got any potential error. And if I got an error, well then for now, I simply want to log that. So I'm logging my error. The then block is interesting, of course. Here I get back my data. And this data here now is super interesting because this, of course, is my list of meetups. So it is basically this list, these 3 nodes, including this key, and of course all the content in there. I will get rid of the first one because we have no valid date here. You can just click the X. The other 2s have, well, ugly names and descriptions, but a valid date. And I will soon clear this anyways to start fresh, but let's go with that for now. So that's the data. These 2 values are what I expect to fetch. What I can now do is I can create a new array. I'll call it meetups, and it's an empty array. I want to store all the meetups I fetch in there. Now, data, of course, already is a list of all the elements in the meetups node, but these meetups don't have the shape I need for my application. So I need to transform that data. So I will store an object here where I simply access my data, and there I have the val helper method. Val basically gives us access to the values in the data we fetched here because we get some additional metadata too. So object here is the actual value I want to use. That will be an object, not an array, an object where I have a couple of properties. Each key is a property, and the value of each property would be another object with the detailed data. So that is what I get with val, this object with property value pairs. Now, since I have an object and not an array, and I want to transform all the elements in this object, so to say, I can create a for loop and basically loop through all the keys in my object. Because again, just because it's so important, I get an object with 2 properties in this case. The property is the key here, this strange ID, and the value would be another object. So now I'm looping through all the keys of the object I got, so an object with these 2 properties. And inside this loop, I now have access to that object which holds the detailed information for each meetup. So with that here, I'm looping through all the keys in object. So I can now use this meetups array I created up here and push a new object on it. This will now be an object I construct manually, where I want to ensure that I have an ID, which is just a key, actually. This key Firebase gives me, where I have a title. This will be now object, then access the key, because again, it's so important. Object is not an array, it is an object. We have these strange IDs generated by Firebase as keys. So by accessing the key on the object, I get access to, well, basically this object stored in that property. And on this object here, I'm interested in the title, and then I repeat the same for the description, object, key, description, and for the image URL, which I also stored, object, key, image URL, and so on. So let's do the same for the date. Here, object, key, date, and that is it for now. The interesting thing here, of course, is where do we call this? And what do we do with this meetups array? Well, we'll call it soon. Before we do though, after leaving this for loop, I want to commit a new mutation, which I'll call set loaded meetups. And I have to create that. I will pass this array of meetups, which I populate here, to it. Up in my mutations, here I'll add a new mutation, set loaded meetups. This one here, I do expect to get my state here, and of course the payload. And then inside there, I will just say state loaded meetups. So I'll access this array, which right now holds hard-coded values, loaded meetups, and set it equal to payload, so to that array I created and I fetched. So that's what I do. Now, of course, it would also be interesting to decide where should we call this action, where should we dispatch it, when should we fetch all these meetups. I want to do this in the main.js file, because that's the file where I load my app. So we already got this created method, and this is called whenever this root Vue instance is created. So it sounds like a good place to load all the meetups. So what I'll do here is I'll add some code after we initialize Firebase, and there I will now call this store dispatch and call load meetups. So this action we just created in the store, load meetups, this one. So that's what I do here. Let's save this and see if it works. If we go back to the application and we reload it, well, we see a strange behavior here. If we explore meetups, we see the meetups. If I go back, we see the meetups. But if I reload the application, you will notice at the beginning, for a brief second, you saw the meetup in New York, then it becomes black, and then the new meetups are loaded. The reason for this is that when we dispatch this load meetups method, it of course takes a second to fetch the meetups. So maybe it would be nice to see a loader whilst we are fetching meetups. And we can easily implement that. If you go back to the store, we already have the set loading mutation, which sets the loading state to true, or to whatever the payload is actually. We can take advantage of this. When we load the meetups, why don't we commit set loading first, set it to true, copy that, and set it to false here once we get the meetups, maybe after we actually committed that. And also if you got an error, because it's not loading anymore. We got an error, but it's not loading anymore. So with that in place, all we need to do is add a loader. So let's go to the home.vue file. And here we get this carousel where we want to basically make sure we only show it if we loaded all the elements. Let's head over to Vuetify.js for this to see which component can help us with that. If we click on components, we actually see that we get this progress and activity component thing. So here, why don't we pick one of these loaders? An indeterminate one makes sense because we don't know when we'll be finished. So what I can do here is I can simply pick any of these. Let's maybe pick this one, the first one. Go back to our application and add it. So I'll add a new V layout here. In this V layout, I'll add a new V flex element. Make this X as 12 to span the full width on all devices. And let's also add a class which is text X as center to make sure the loader, which is an inline element, is centered. Now in there, let's paste our circular loader in there with the indeterminate directive to make sure it keeps on spinning and we don't manually have to adjust the percentages it's loaded. Let me split this over multiple lines. Of course, feel free to adjust the color of it. I'll also then bind to width and set this to 7. And size, which I'll set to 70, and feel free to play around with these to see how it changes the size of the loader. And then I also want to add VIF and check if it's loading. And only if loading is true, I want to show this spinner. Now with that, I can go back to my computer properties down there, add the loading property, and in there I want to return the value of my loading getter, which we have in the store. So with that, let's reload this application and we see the spinner. And once we're done, well, we see a black carousel. We saw the carousel before. The reason for this is simple. Here, I'm checking for loading, but I'm showing the carousel at all times. So we can go to the layout with the carousel and add if not loading on the whole layout, on the whole row here. And now what we should see is that if we load this, we just see the spinner, and then we get the carousel with the loaded meetups. So now we got this working as it should work, loading the meetups when we need them. Now as a final step, I'll clear up my database here and remove both meetups. This will not change my display here, but But if I go back, reload it, we see an empty carousel. Now we could improve this user experience. What I want to do is I want to improve it by organizing a new one. For that, I'll organize a new meetup. And now I will copy that link here, give it a new name. So that's the New York meetup, if I'm not mistaken here. Location is New York, therefore, maybe with a lowercase o. Enter the image. Awesome. New York meetup. And let's pick a time, maybe 6 September, 6 p.m. like that. Let's hit create meetup. And you see it works, even though I'm not logged in. So that's something I also want to change. I'll do that in the next video though. I want to make sure that only authenticated users can create new meetups, and that we also store the ID of the user who created a meetup in the database. Because right now, we get a new meetup, but we get no idea who created it, because we're also not enforcing that the user needs to be signed up, needs to be able to create meetups, so that we need the user to be signed in. So let's fix this in the next video.